Hello and welcome to the eighth class of our study of the book by Walter Brueggemann called Out of Empire, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus. For this week, we went over chapter 7, and we'll be going through it throughout the course of our time together today. And it is called Life Force from Below. And as if you've been with us in previous lessons, you'll know that this book focuses on pivotal moments or pivotal verses in the book of Exodus. And the verses that Walter Brueggemann has highlighted as pivotal for this week's chapter are found in Exodus chapter 12, verses 31 through 32. And they read, and you'll have to ignore the erroneous labeling there where I put Exodus 10:26. That was from last week's. But this week's is from Exodus 12, verses 31 and 32. And it reads as follows. Rise up. Go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go worship the Lord, as you said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you said, and be gone. And bring a blessing on me too. That last line is really the pivotal line of these pivotal verses, and we'll speak more on that in a second. This request for that the Pharaoh makes to Moses to bring a blessing back on to him. This happens after the 10th and final plague, and make no mistake about it, the worst plague. And after this plague, Pharaoh's power and sway have been utterly depleted. His courtiers and his advisors, his magicians have known this for some time and have been imploring him to let the people go, but he's been bargaining with them back and forth and trying to find a way of letting them go with his honor intact. And he has found no way forward because Moses, as we learned last week, insists on every Israelite and every livestock down to the last hoof be let go. And Pharaoh had resisted up until now. He has no other card to play. And so he sends the Israelites away without qualification or stipulation. And if we are looking for any indication in the biblical narrative that anyone is saddened by the deaths of the Egyptians' firstborn children and livestock, we will be disappointed. And by we, I guess I should say I have hoped for some indication that there is some uneasiness in the story about what happens here, but that doesn't seem to be the point. And there really, as was the case with the other plagues where livestock and fields of grain, fields of produce were wiped out. The point seems to be Pharaoh's discovery that he has no power, and all that is lost in the meantime seem to be, I'll say, props in this divine display of power over and against Pharaoh and benefiting the ones that Pharaoh had subjugated. In the text, the event is merely reported on in blunt fashion. And we read, at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was a loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. And those two verses, chapter 12, verse 29 and 30, come just before today's pivotal verses, which will be 31 and 32 that follow. And Brueggemann does not engage in this chapter in a lengthy discussion about whether or not the killing of presumably innocent children and livestock was justified. Instead, Brueggemann focuses on the meaning behind the act, which I take to be the transference of suffering away from the enslaved Israelites and onto the empire, the system that had subjugated them. Quoting Brueggemann from page 51, the narrative had begun with a cry of anguish among the slaves, but now that cry will be transferred to the lips of the soon-to-be bereft Egyptians. End quote. The death-dealing ways of the Egyptian empire and of the Pharaoh have now come home to roost. The Pharaoh who would order the deaths of all Hebrew children has now experienced, all Hebrew newborn children, male children, I should be more specific. Well, that Pharaoh has now experienced the depths of the suffering that he had caused. To quote again from verse 30, Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. It is likely that every Hebrew household had been touched by death because of the actions of Pharaoh and his economy. Now the empire knows this sort of pain firsthand and from the top down. Quoting again from Brueggemann, page 52, this is a loud cry from the regime, a recognition of extreme vulnerability, an acknowledgement of impotence. This is a revelation to Pharaoh. He now knows that the power dynamics have completely shifted. He had believed that he held within his might the power to distribute life and death as he saw fit, to bless and to curse. Now he finds himself at the mercy of Yahweh and Yahweh's agents. To quote verse 32 in a second, this is why Pharaoh does more than send the Israelites away. He makes one final request of Moses. Pharaoh asks Moses to bring a blessing back to him. Verse 32, take your flocks and your herds, as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing back on me too. This marks a significant shift in the perspective of the Pharaoh. He now understands that he does not hold the power over life and death to bless and to curse. Of blessing, Brueggemann writes in page 54, to bless is to implant or to indwell the force of life into another person. The entire process of bless is a transitive verb that assumes that such a life force, such capacity for vitality, can indeed be transferred from one agent to another. That transfer, moreover, is readily assumed to be an act that moves from the stronger to the weaker, from the better endowed to the lesser endowed, from the authorized to the unauthorized. Fairly self-explanatory quote, but to summarize, blessing is thought to come out of the abundance of one's life force. One's ability to bless stems from their place in life, the authority that they wield, the possessions that they have been entrusted with or that they hold as their own possessions. And it is assumed that the ones at the top of the hierarchy are the ones who are most suited to bless, and that the blessing will more or less trickle down. It is assumed from the biblical perspective that in the biblical narratives that God is at the top of this and has supreme authority and ability to bless. Just as we read in the creation account in Genesis 1, from the beginning, God blessed them, being the first humans, saying, be fruitful and multiply. It's from Genesis 1:22. And indeed, the scriptures are filled with stories about God bestowing blessing on various peoples. Brueggemann cites numerous examples from the scriptures where God blesses, sometimes by way of human agents. For example, when a priest speaks a blessing onto the people in the name of God, you have the priest as the intermediary, but the blessing, make no mistake, comes from God. He writes of this on page 55, in all such uses, blessing is a top-down act from God or from God's human agents, because those who occupy the top have resources for life to share. This top-down common sense perspective transfers into ordinary life, in which power, people, political leaders, bankers, celebrities, sports stars give the appearance of having more life force and a capacity to bestow that life force on those who have less of it. And to find these pictures, I just typed in the queen blessing or the queen giving gifts, and I found these two pictures. So I found that it's funny how they're almost identical. Even the backdrop is similar. They seem to be doing this in the same room, probably on the same date years later in the case of Trump. But anyway, I thought that was kind of funny. But you have two people who presumably in the world stage hold power, hold influence, hold resources, and could bestow blessing. In this case, the Queen and the President of the United States bestowing blessing on each other is the idea. Only able to do so because of their station in life. And Pharaoh assumed this perspective, that he had all the power, food, wealth, and resources. In short, he viewed himself as arbiter and distributor of blessing, of the life force. To quote Brueggemann again, Pharaoh had a monopoly on life force, enough to bless all those who lived in conformity with his enterprise. All this being considered, for Pharaoh to ask Moses to bring him back a blessing is significant. From Pharaoh's perspective, this is to ask for life from the bottom up, thus turning the power pyramid on its head. This may not have made sense to Pharaoh, but this does reflect a counter theme in the scriptures. As Brueggemann writes, there's a counter theme of blessing moving up from below. Such a notion is profoundly counterintuitive, for it is easy enough to think that those below have no such capacity. And here the Pharaoh discovers that those who he had thought of as below have the capacity now to bless him with life force, which is why he asks it. And at this point, Brueggemann cites several passages in the Psalms in which we read of life force as blessing flowing from the bottom up to the very top, up, in fact, to God. You may have noticed this, the words like we find in Psalm chapter 16, verse 7, I bless the Lord who gives me counsel, or I will bless the Lord at all times. I will bless you as long as I live, from Psalm 63. Or from Psalm 115, but we will bless the Lord from this time on and forevermore. Or Psalm 145, every day I will bless you. And then again in Psalm 145, all flesh will bless his holy name forever and ever. And then there is a liturgy that is put in the mouth of King Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 8, which reads, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. Blessed be the Lord who has given rest to his people Israel according to all that he promised. And the point quoted on page 56 is as follows. Perhaps not too much should be made of such a familiar formula. And yet the formula, for all its familiarity, is astonishing. It suggests that adherents to Yahweh, the ones who have received life from Yahweh, can respond by the bestowal of life force upon Yahweh. This is an articulation of a dialogical transaction from God that does not assume God's all-sufficiency. Rather, God can have added to God's own life by the act of the psalmist or of Israel or of all flesh. The phrase, bless the Lord, may mean nothing more than praise, but the rhetoric itself suggests more than that, even concerning God's own life, which is really an astonishing claim. And I think for Brueggemann, here's more of a supposal. How if the life that has been bestowed upon us can be given back, can be yielded back to the source of all life in this reciprocal relationship of love, to where we bless the Lord and add to God's joy, add to God's pleasure, add to God's being, as it were, out of the abundance of life that God has given us. This, you see blessing multiply and multiply as it comes from the bottom where we have received it and back up. And Brueggemann wants us to see in the interchange between Pharaoh and Moses in Exodus chapter 12 a reflection of this principle, that blessing flows from the bottom up, from the lowly to those seemingly above, from the meek to the powerful, that our concepts of power and our ideas about who holds the keys to life are backwards and upside down. Now Pharaoh, the ultimate top-down blessed, has no blessing to bestow. Pharaoh is empty of life force, which is why he asks a blessing from what he had perceived to be the bottom. And in the gospel narratives, we see Jesus living out this principle by the Son of God condescending and washing the feet of the disciples and calling himself the servant of all, to show what it looks like for the blessing to flow from the bottom up, even in the person of God incarnate. Brueggemann wants us to see this pattern repeated again and again in the Gospels, that the same inversion of power to bless, no longer from above, but now from below, is reiterated in the narrative of Jesus in the gospel tradition. Jesus is situated amid, yet remains apart from, the established officials who might be expected to bless the people with life. In Jesus' day, the Roman emperor, governing officials, and those who held power within religious institutions believed that they held the power to bless, or the force for life. In contrast to them, Jesus, without credential and with no certification from the official roster, performs the power for life among the needy who could get no help from officialdom. Thus, the summary of his performance, whereby many disqualified people are blessed with life, quoting from Luke chapter 7, verse 22, the blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, the poor have good news brought to them. And I'll conclude with a more lengthy quote from the chapter and then reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And Brueggemann writes to conclude the chapter, the capstone of the interface between top-down power and bottom-up power is, of course, the dramatic account of the execution of Jesus at the hands of the Roman Empire. The authorities had quickly discerned that Jesus' capacity with transformative power was a threat to the status quo. The top-down authorities of absolute power almost always seek to eliminate unmanageable alternative sources of life power. That is what happens in this narrative. The dramatic account of the trial of Jesus before Rome tells of a characteristic act of power from above to squelch power from below. And as an aside, my own aside, Brueggemann is writing this so that we can begin to see the parallels between Jesus's life and position against Rome's power with Moses's position against Egypt's power. He goes on in the quote, as Mark tells it, however, by the end of that Friday execution, just as Jesus breathed his last, the decisive testimony is from the Roman centurion. That soldier assigned to maintain order at the state execution is, in the narrative, a full representative of the Roman Empire that was accustomed to having a monopoly on the power to bless. In that awesome moment of the narrative, the imperial soldier arrives at an awareness and a testimony that disrupts the totalism of Rome. Truly, this man was God's son. Mark 15, verse 39. This terse utterance is the unambiguous acknowledgement of the empire that the one executed by the state is indeed the carrier of life force from God. This is remarkable, dramatic acknowledgement that Mark does not explain. The verdict of Rome is left to linger there, a recognition that power lies outside the empire in this one who has now been executed, but not eliminated. There is, I suggest, complete continuity between the final imperative of Pharaoh, bless me, and the verdict of the centurion, this was truly God's son. The agent of Rome came to echo what the Lord of Egypt had recognized. The power to bless is not within the grasp of the empire. The God of emancipation, once represented by Moses, is, in the Gospel of Mark, performed or embodied by this uncredentialed carrier of life. So in short, the Roman centurion at the cross came to understand what Pharaoh could not until the very end. Or to quote 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29, this is what they could not understand. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, to reduce to nothing things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. Now I will bring up the first question for discussion. I ask that you all unmute yourselves. And the first question is this, or series of questions. With the devastation of the 10th plague, the balance of power definitively shifts from Pharaoh to Moses, God's agent. In his defeat, Pharaoh recognizes this power as the capacity to bless, to transfer life force from the stronger to the weaker, from the better endowed to the lesser endowed, from the authorized to the unauthorized. How do these categories take on different meaning when a powerful figure is forced to acknowledge that the power for life rests with a supposedly weak group of enslaved people? How might this new understanding challenge a typical interpretation of socio-political power in our current context?
I guess I was kind of thinking about Texas. I think there's another state that's changed their abortion laws, whereas the government has created what they thought was right up above. And now from the states, they're coming back and saying, no, I think we should do it this way. Socially, that's, I don't know. Most of the time, we little people don't have a lot of power over our government.
Well, when whatever the issue may be, whatever the social issue of the day may be, I just watched a documentary on Richard Nixon called Tricky Dick, and it was, and in that documentary, some of the things that were caught on tape that he himself taped in the White House about his cavalier disregard for the lives of the soldiers that were being sent to Vietnam, to the people who are protesting the Vietnam War, to the people who were being bombed in Vietnam. I mean, he literally said in so many words, I couldn't really care less. How can we smooth this over for re-election? But it was when there were people en masse with a negative opinion of him, the little people, as you said, that that voiced their opposition to either that war, which, you know, I know is probably a very an issue that's very close to your heart, Sue, because I know John, who's in the room, served in that war, or whether it was about any other issue. But it was when the little people said in a unified voice from the ground up what they thought, that those tapes that he recorded himself change in tone and in tenor, and he begins to care, and he begins to think actually that maybe the power does rest in from the ground up. And the shift was very noticeable in the documentary I write. And the people, the little people, of whom there are more of us than there are of the people at the top, we have more power than we think.
Yeah. Yesterday there was I don't know what you call it, a Zoom performance. No, not yesterday, Monday, a Zoom performance in honor of Martin Luther King Day. My husband watches these things. I typically don't, but they do these reenactments of Greek tragedies as a way to connect people around PTSD. I don't watch, I mean, they're like 3 hours long. I don't see them. But on Monday, they did a reading of one of Martin Luther King's last sermons called The Drum Major Instinct. It was a sermon he gave at the Ebenezer Baptist Church like 2 weeks before he was assassinated. And it was really so good because everything he said pertained to things that are going on today. He said everybody wants to be the drum major. Everybody has this ego that wants to be out front, wants to be important, wants to be seen, wants to be valued. And you know, in some ways, you know, that's just human. But there are people in our society who take that to really extreme ends. And I guess Pharaoh would have been one of those, you know, who had to have the most gold, the most power, this extreme position of being God. And unfortunately, even today, there are people like that who have this even mesmerizing power over others to think that, make us think that, you know, they are really, really special and wonderful and have all the answers. And, you know, it's, I don't know. I think that this idea that a power shakeup and realizing what the extreme need of the ego to kind of consolidate this image of power, how dangerous that can be. And it doesn't just belong to like one set of people, it belongs to every person. You know, it's every person that engages in this kind of this drama. And it's so harmful. I mean, he really came back to the principles of Jesus. I mean, that was the very last thing that he had to say. It was very moving. So I don't know, it just tied into this chapter, I think, quite well, you know, with looking at the life of Jesus in the end and what's really important. The power model needs to be undone. So.
Well, in the text, he says, there is, I suggest, complete continuity between the final imperative of Pharaoh, bless me, and the verdict of the centurion, this truly was God's son. This is when Jesus was on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
So Brueggemann is continually taking these pivotal moments in Exodus and bringing them forward into the New Testament. I mean, is that an unusual thing to do? It's
actually done in the Gospels themselves, especially in the Gospel of Matthew, where we are to recognize the parallels between Jesus's early life and the plight of the Israelites, where they find themselves back in Egypt, and then in Exodus out of Egypt, always fleeing for their lives. And it's not uncommon. And oftentimes in the lectionary, the gospel readings having to do with the life of Jesus will correspond with some part of the journey of Israel's life out of Egypt, and to give us a sense of this, the patterns being, finding echoes in the story. I cut you off. I have a bad habit of that. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, you didn't cut me off. I'm just wondering if at the time of the Exodus, if this was a foretelling of what was to come, or if this is something that was inferred looking backward.
I think the gospel writers saw the patterns after the fact. I'm not aware that anybody read the Exodus narrative as prophecy, but more as a revelatory story about what God wanted to do for the people, for their behalf, and to liberate them. But to see and the story of, this is why when people are trying to figure out who Jesus is and where Jesus fits, and who John the Baptist is and who this is, they'll often liken them to, is this a new Elijah? Is this a new Moses? Or when in the Transfiguration, when Jesus goes up to the hill and is revealed to be divine by blinding light, and the people who come and visit are Moses and Elijah, and they build, the impulse of the disciples is to build huts for them, because they saw in that moment that Jesus was a part of their story and the work that they had been about.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't you think the results were two different things? I mean, the Israelites were going to the Jews, were going to the promised land. No, maybe not. Because now the Christians and the Jews can go to New Jerusalem. Maybe not. Maybe it's the same.
I like the term echoes of the story, to where it's never the exact same story or the same chapter, but you see the God who liberates working towards the same ends in new contexts. And so the gospel has a global scope. It has all peoples and all tribes and all peoples invited into the work of God. And the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt really had to do with the 12 tribes of Israel and their narrative. But the tie-in is passages like in Romans, where Paul would describe us as a branch. I think the 14th chapter, maybe, of Romans, where we're a branch grafted into this tree that is growing, that has roots in history, but is still new life is coming and sprouting from it. We're part of it, a new part of it, and it's not the same story, and it means something different in every time, and it manifests differently. That's how I look at it.
Thank you.
I think we have to remember that the Israelites, although they were given the promised land, when they had the judges, many times they were being ruled by the Philistines and other groups of people. They really weren't what I would consider in the promised land. I mean, I would think that they would be ruling if they were in the promised land. And then, of course, by the time Saul and David comes along, then they have some power and authority. And then after that, even when Jesus is born, they're underneath Roman authority. They're not a nation anymore. They're underneath Rome.
They really only had a couple of generations, like really David and Solomon. And then it really was, they didn't lose it all in a hurry, but it really was in decline ever after that. The Davidic monarchy was viewed as the apex, what they missed, what they pined to return to. And of course, the stories around that, as we always view our own past, you view your past through rose-colored glasses. You have to wonder if the past was ever as good as those that were there paint it to be. I'm beginning to remember my own childhood that way.
Welcome to middle age.
I'm on my way.
It creeps up on you.
That's right.
Well, we'll move on to the second question.
Yeah.
In the end, Nancy left us. Bye, Nancy. In the end, I'm not going to put it on the screen because it's easier for me to see your faces and go back and forth. In the end, death rather than the power for life is visited on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. A cry of pain and what the author calls extreme vulnerability, once on the lips of the enslaved, shatters the empire. Why does it so often require extreme distress for those who occupy the top, monopolize resources, and believe they alone have the power to bless, to finally acknowledge the vitality that wells up from below? How does someone in a position of privilege come to recognize this illusion of entitlement and align with God's emancipation and life force from below? And that question threw me to a place of pessimism, because actually in my observation of stories where those who from below rose up, I was thinking of the antebellum South and the myths woven about the antebellum South after the freedom of the slaves, like that film that was screened in Woodrow Wilson's White House called
Birth of a Nation.
Birth of a Nation was a blockbuster hit. Portrays the plight of the plantation owners as bleak and like they were sorely done by. And I just don't see very many times where those who lose power that was wrongly come by actually do find solidarity with the people who are rising up from the bottom. You don't see that with Pharaoh here. He doesn't make a switch and then, find. You see resistance in South Africa. I don't know enough to speak to the situation in India, except for that Mahendra Modi is characterized as a ultra nationalist who is making it more difficult for people to live well together. I don't know that question. How does someone in a position of privilege come to recognize this illusion of entitlement? I don't see that happening very often, but they asked us to come up with some examples of what it looks like. So I guess I've failed. I'll throw it over to you.
You should have put the answers in the book.
Yeah,
that would have been good. Have them in the back. So if you lose it, you can go look them up.
Nothing back there.
I suppose there are sometimes, is it Buffett that's giving money away to different organizations and things like that?
He's known for living in the house that he's always lived in.
And driving the old car.
Yeah.
He's got a really old car.
I suppose that kind of points towards the direction that this question is leading, and where somebody understands that maybe the economic system that made them wealthy isn't the best one. And so I guess to game the system, use the leverage they have to change things. Maybe. I don't know enough about Warren Buffett. I thought you meant Jimmy Buffett at first.
Me too.
I don't know enough about Warren Buffett to know really what motivates him, because that's the other thing about, you have Carnegie libraries for a reason, right? For him, it was PR. I'm grateful for them. I loved the quaint one that was in my hometown back in Darlington. And I'm sure you're familiar with them, but when he spoke to his contemporaries about why he built libraries, it was good public relations. It wasn't a fundamental change of heart.
When you said libraries, I thought about Dolly Parton. She has done so much. When the fires came through Pigeon Forge and down in that area, so she gave a lot of money to get things rebuilt and that. And then she has this library thing that she sends a book. Is it a month? Every month she sends a book to children so that they'll have a way to learn new things.
Yeah, and she's a good example of someone who did not come from privilege, who's always given back. I mean, she's a real example of somebody who's truly humanitarian that, gives back constantly.
But guess where she came from?
Where?
She came from poverty.
That's right. She did not come from privilege.
I think that
she understands.
Yeah.
So the question here is,
she's lived a life.
So the question here is, how does someone in a position of privilege come to recognize this illusion? I mean, even in my own life, I've had this sort of illusion that, I come from small town Indiana. Ha ha ha. I come from so much privilege, it hurts. I grew up in this really small little brick house in Franklin, and my dad had this modest job. We were shoe store owners, but dang, we lived in a life where, my great grandmother and her brother and sister went to college. I mean, how privileged is that? And why was that possible? You have to go back. I mean, I think these last few years I've had to really sit back and think about that. Like, how did all that happen? I mean, what were my ancestors, even the ones who weren't doing all that great, didn't end up with houses and college degrees? What were they doing in 1865 compared to some of the other families in town? I'll just say the Black families in town. What were they doing in 1865? They had nothing. They were freed from slavery, but what the heck did they have? They didn't have educations. They didn't have money. They didn't have land. They had nothing. And they're still scrambling to get. And I also had families on the other side of my family tree who fought in the Civil War, and they lost a lot. There was a great-great-grandfather who died in a prison in Ohio. He was a Confederate soldier, and he died there. And last time he saw I guess he was a 3 times great-grandfather. Last time he saw my twice great-grandfather, he was a baby. So that left my great-great-grandmother or 3 times great-grandmother with these 3 little kids. And I'm desperately poor after the Civil War. And so that set in motion, who knows what? Poverty, resentment, violence. I mean, who knows what? So there wasn't privilege on that side, but there are all kinds of things to consider in this whole equation. But I don't know that people have thought a lot about these things. But what do I need to give back as a result of what's been given to me? And I don't know. I mean, do other people like me think about this when they walk around and they see, people who can't eat, people sitting on street corners, and they think, oh, well, they didn't work hard enough. Well, maybe they didn't have the same circumstances that I've had. I've had the ability to work most of my life. Now I can't, but, I mean, it's just, it's been a real wake-up call. working on the reservation too. I mean, people have the idea, well, they live on the government dole. You know, they have so much given to them. Well, no, I mean, these folks in 1865 got marched off of their land and onto a compound where they had such lousy drinking water. A bunch of people died of dysentery. You know, their women, nobody had sexually transmitted diseases, but the women ended up being raped by the soldiers or trying to negotiate with the soldiers to get anything, food, decent water. So things like syphilis and other diseases were introduced into the Navajo people just so they could survive. I mean, and you know, you hear stereotypes like, oh, they're just a bunch of dirty, lazy Indians. It just isn't true. But most people don't have the knowledge or the awareness or even the inclination to learn about these things. And I don't know how to get other people to, I mean, I'm obviously, I don't know enough yet. I don't understand enough. And I don't know I don't know what to do. So there it is. Sorry. I just ranted for about six minutes. I'm sorry.
I think I see a distinction between privilege and power.
Yeah, I don't have any power. I have no power.
And, you know, and so what, to me, I mean, I guess I can see myself in your spot too, is I didn't grow up wanting or, you know, and yet I look back at some of the photographs and some of the albums that I've been going through, and neither one of my families came from any kind of wealth whatsoever, you know, and, you know, their surroundings didn't look like they were very stable. But as far as power goes, like with Pharaoh, he lost everything. He lost all power. He lived in privilege because of his power. And I don't think like you said, Heath, I don't think we see very many people who have done so much wrong with their power that we know that they did anything good afterwards. When you look at the ruler of Japan during World War I, you know, or II, the goal was to rule the world. Mm-hmm. So once he was no longer in a position to do that, and once the Japanese people grew to understand that what they were being taught by him was totally wrong, that all the rest of the people in the world were not bad people after them, which is what he had been saying to them all along. And Hitler, mm-hmm. You know, if he'd have lived, do we see him turning around and doing something good in the world? I think he knew he couldn't, and that's why he was either killed or he killed himself. I think he killed himself.
Yeah, he did.
But I just don't see many instances in history where power. Pardon me?
Unless you're one of those ones who think that he moved to an underground cavern in Antarctica with a bunch of aliens.
Yeah, no. No, I'm not on board with that. I just don't see many instances in history where these power people turned around and did something good. Privilege can turn around. I've seen more instances of privilege turned around where people, you know, all of a sudden awakened to, oh, look around me and things are, I could help in this instance. I can do something. You get people that donate their money and not.
Oh, she's unstable.
Yeah, she just posed.
You know, where is that coming from?
What if we take this to think about Christians being people of privilege and how they can help? That is something we can think through, I think.
That's one of the things that a lot of the what came to my mind here was when you said that was the parable, the rich, it wasn't a parable, it was an encounter Jesus had with the rich young ruler and gave him something very practical to do. What his conversion to the gospel meant was to divest himself of the resources that he had for the life of his community. And that's where your mind went with Warren Buffett. And that's the kind of the idea that in my role as pastor, I try to help people come to see. But my dream, what will break my heart to see in a good way, what will bring me to tears, would be for there to be the modern equivalent of a pharaoh say what the centurion said, or see what the centurion saw in that moment, and to completely, with the power, with all of the responsibilities, without having to be removed from those things, have a conversion to the gospel, and then to be different. that's where the pessimism hits me. But as individuals, as Christians who have been entrusted, like the parable of the stewards, Sue, where we each have, been entrusted with, I don't know, where we fit, whether it's the 1, the 3, or the 10 talents or whatever. What we do with that is very important, and will reflect to what degree we value the right things. I feels like this question could hit us. It has hit us in several different places. There's the question that Connie brought us back to, which was, well, what of those who are like the pharaohs of the world? And then there's the question about our own place in this, like where we fit, and to what degree the difference between power and privilege. And we all do have some power. I mean, as a pastor, I have certain ways of influencing the community around me. And then we, in our own context, with our kids, our loved ones, our friends, have some sort of power and some sort of sway. And I think that this lesson has practical applications for all of us. And it's easier for those of us who aren't the pharaohs, frankly, because it seems like by the time they get to that place,
that was kind of the point I was making. By the time they are to that point, that the ego has taken over so much of their being, that there's almost no return.
Yeah.
I hope maybe that will be, I bet that maybe that will be our Constantine, although I have problems with Constantine and what happened in history with the Roman emperor's conversion there. But maybe there will be like somebody who will convert not for military conquest, but really have a change of heart and a first-term president having an altar call experience that has the next 3 years to just like go nuts, with that. But that just seems, oh boy.
I don't think scripture tells us something like that's going to happen.
Yeah,
I think scripture says just be rare. Things are going to get worse. A whole lot worse before it gets better.
That'll be my sermon next week, I think.
We'll be watching, waiting, watching.
Well, it's almost 3. Let's try to hit at this last question before we move on, because we haven't been making it through these questions, which is a good thing, actually. I think I see that as a good sign. The third question is, in the Gospels, Jesus' uncredentialed restoration of vulnerable and disqualified people draws the ire of those in power who cannot abide unmanageable alternative sources of life power. In Exodus and the Gospels, what is the result when the establishment resists the authentic power for life? Is there ever an opportunity for a regime to acknowledge the reality of this life force from below and respond with humility? What would this look like? It's the same thing we've been talking about. What would this look like? Can you think of any examples? And we've touched on a few already. But Sue, to your point, it just doesn't seem like, I think if we're looking for even the best of our institutions and governments for the answers, they're always going to be, the theologian Paul Tillich said that all institutions are inherently demonic. And he didn't mean that they were like embodied by like literal demons as we find in the Gospels, but he meant like they're as soon as you have an institution, even a church, it's tendency tends to be to preserve itself for its own sake against what is good for everyone else. Yeah. And so it's demonic in that it turns inward instead of outward, turns narcissistic, self-focused, self-absorbed. And so when he says there's never an opportunity for a regime to acknowledge, it just is hard to imagine. But maybe my imagination is too small.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, my impression was that initially they did do good work, because people could not have lived with each other had they not, because so many crimes have been committed on both sides.
It's an amazing story.
And I mean, I know things always seem to settle back down into these, the whatever grudges we hold against each other, whatever bad ideas we have about each other, they still seem to simmer down into those camps. But the peace that was established through that commission seemed to help a lot to restore order and peace in South Africa. So I don't know, is that something that that this would look like? I mean, the humility part.
That informs my sermon coming up. It's not written yet. I've been having trouble with it. It's on my favorite Bible passage in Luke chapter 4, verses 14 through 21, where Jesus reads the scroll from Isaiah and sets it down and says, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." That's my favorite Bible passage. And I thought that it would be pretty easy for me to go and find my 3 or 4 best sermons on that and kind of pull from them all and write bring a new fresh perspectives to it. And I discovered I have never preached on my favorite Bible passage. I have referenced it often in sermons. I've pulled it into sermons, as sort of as an aside or something that informs the discussion. I've never preached on it specifically. And but one thing that I believe about what that passage is that Jesus is saying, the realm of God, these things that Isaiah talked about, good news for the poor, freedom, the captive being freed, the sight for the blind, which has more to do with just our literal sight, but our spiritual sight and gaining in wisdom as well. The oppressed, lose the oppressed free. So whatever you're oppressed by, freed, and then the year of the Lord's favor, which is the year of Jubilee. The point that what I've coming to believe about that, and Jesus saying that this happens now, is that it does happen in pockets wherever the values of God and the values, the person that Jesus embodied plays out in real time, where people and communities and pockets, it gets traction. And you see that, but it doesn't ever seem to, the hope, the vision, the eschatological vision, the vision for the end of times is for all of it from the top down to have been transformed, or whatever is able to be saved will be saved. We've been talking about that in recent weeks. But for the meantime, where we are now, like what can we do now? I just feel like we can do our best to cultivate pockets of this as best as we are able. And with what you were talking about, Judy, the panel for Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, for those of you who may know the story, but if you don't, the gist of it is, after the apartheid fell, there was felt a need to set up a truth commission where they were going to get at the truth and just punish the people who had been the cruelest, or the people who were responsible for the status quo. And Desmond Tutu and other religious leaders, Christian leaders, said this can't be all about retribution. We need to tell the truth, but we need to reconcile. And so that changed the whole nature of what went next. So instead of bringing people forward to tell the truth to punish them for crimes, they brought people forward to tell the truth to the people they had abused, and for the people who had been oppressed to actually explain to them what the consequences had been, what it had been like to live under their rule, with the end goal being reconciling, meaning at the end of the day, some people will answer for crimes, but we have to live with one another when we get out of jail, when there's been, when the legal components of this have been satisfied. We have to live well as a society. So how can we be reconciled? And stories, transcripts of those encounters, that happen at these before the panel for truth and reconciliation are astonishing. Where people for decades had been enemies, found room for forgiveness and for repentance too. Because when your goal isn't just punishing, but like reconciliation, it gives you avenues for repentance for those who had done wrong to say, I'm sorry, which is.
I can't think of that lady that lived in, I think, Terre Haute.
Eva Kor.
Yeah.
The one that was in the.
Yeah.
Auschwitz.
She was a part of Mengele's experiments. She had a twin sister.
Yeah. And yet, after years of hatred and stuff, she learned that she had to forgive. That was her lesson. She needed to forgive. And she actually became friends with one of the guards, I believe. And they created a relationship with one another. And so I think that's what we need to do. We need to look at each other and forgive each other and go forward.
The reconciliation piece requires forgiveness. The importance of the truth part is sometimes, so for Eva Kor, I don't remember the details of that specific friendship where she made, I remember it vaguely, I don't remember it specifically, but it seems to me that to become reconciled with somebody who had perhaps even tortured you or your sister in her case, they would have to name the truth and own up to the truth and say, we did this thing and it was a terrible thing, and to feel true sorrow and remorse for it. It's kind of, it's what makes asking for forgiveness or giving forgiveness sometimes one-sided, when the other party is just like, I'm not really sorry. You can forgive me if that frees you, but what's it to me? I don't really care. The importance of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa was it insisted on the truth being told. Where in this case, if you were going to put Pharaoh in this situation, Pharaoh would be given an opportunity and hopefully find it within himself to say, this is what I did. This is how I caused suffering, and I'm profoundly sorry. So that the Israelites could have not only forgiven, but then have found that they could even stay neighbors and live maybe on the edge of Egypt and whatever, that is highly idealistic, but I think it's what we must hope for when it comes to reconciliation with our enemies. I know that in my own life, when I have had friction in my relationships, my siblings, with my wife, with my kids, when I've come to the realization that I'm wrong, I want to be forgiven immediately, sometimes without really naming the truth clearly. And you need both, is what I'm saying. So what would this look like? You need both. You need truth told, and you need in hopes for forgiveness. The world is a messy place.
Yep.
Yes, indeed.
And all we can do is try to take care of the messes around us. That's what we're exposed to. That's what we know. We can't solve all the problems, but we can work where we are.
That's good to remember sometimes when the problems are overwhelming us. And that's a good note to end on. Thank you for your time and for this lesson, and love you all. I hope to see you soon. Feel better, Janet.
Everybody feel well, stay well, safe travels. Enjoy Florida.
Bye, Larry, wherever you are.
Yeah.
Take care.
Okay. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.